I was wondering if you might recognize a girl in this photograph?
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
Sorry to have bothered you.
When Resident Evil 4 was in its embryonic developmental stage, the series was already well established as the premier horror franchise in gaming. The first game, released in 1996 for the PlayStation by Capcom, is credited as defining the survival horror genre, placing you in a haunted mansion with limited resources and flesh-eating zombies around every corner, among other deadly creatures. The tank controls were cumbersome, the story was uninspired and campy, and the voice acting was horrendous. However, the atmosphere, genuinely frightening for the time, and the game's ammo managing, zombie blasting gameplay were both praised, and the game would go on to inspire countless imitators and serve as the catalyst for 24 sequels. Adulation for the series would only increase with the release of Resident Evil 2 in 1998. The first game in the series to receive truly universal acclaim. It took every facet of the original and proved upon it. The graphics were superior, the environments were more varied, the weapons and gameplay were better, and the voice acting, music, and overall sound design were improved. After its release, plans for the third game were already set in motion. However, the original game in development, headed by Resident Evil director and Resident Evil 2 producer Shinji Mikami, was scrapped as its release would not come before the launch of the PlayStation 2. So, not wanting to release the next main game on a last-gen console, while also not wanting to wait too long for a sequel on the PS2, a project that was meant to be a spin-off of the main series, headed by Resident Evil 2 director Hideki Kamiya, was chosen instead to be the third main game. Released in 1999 with the subtitle Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 took the formula of the original two games but evolved it in ways that were divisive. While generally well received by audiences and critics, some were unimpressed by its shorter length, while others were unhappy with its stronger emphasis on action, as slight as it may have been. While certainly nowhere near the crossroads Capcom would face creatively down the road with the series, the seeds of what would be two of the most contentious issues the series would face were planted in this entry: a creative schism at Capcom and an increased focus on action over horror. The story of how Resident Evil 4 came to be is one of the more fascinating in gaming, a milieu of project switches, creative changes, scrap concepts, and happy accidents that would eventually spawn what is still to this day the most significant entry in the series. In 1999, development for Resident Evil 4 began, with Kamiya once again at the helm. Kamiya wished to stray almost entirely from the series' horror roots, opting for a third-person adventure title with more focus on hack-and-slash action and creating a cool, stylish protagonist. He also opted to get rid of the static camera angles of the original game, implementing a dynamic camera angle which moved with the player. Mikami, however, felt this was too radical a departure from the formula, so this project was turned into its own separate game entirely. A game which would end up being the very first entry in the Devil May Cry franchise, a major series in its own right, which is still going strong today. The game would go through 3 more iterations before the final version was solidified. The second version, dubbed the Fog version, was more akin to classic Resident Evil games of old atmospherically, being set in a foggy mansion with spectre-like enemies terrorising the player. It also marked the first appearance of eventual protagonist Leon S. Kennedy, who returns after being one of the 2 leads in Resident Evil 2. The third version, dubbed the Hookman version, saw Leon being stalked and attacked by a hooked man apparition, similar to Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. While it maintained the vibe of the previous one, it showcased more of the gameplay that would eventually be the cornerstone of the finished product, most notably the behind-the-shoulder camera angle. The next version, dubbed the Hallucination version, was in many ways an evolution of the previous one, with the return of the eponymous Hooked Man. It also introduced new features, some of which would make it into the final game, like sentient knights and Quicktime Events, and some that didn't, like the presence of spectre-like enemies. The final version of the game, which would be first demoed in 2004 before finally being released the following year, would run with the new free camera third-person shooter perspective, while abandoning all the paranormal elements of the earlier versions. In many ways, it was a conceptual and mechanical compromise between the initial action-heavy demo and the creepy, gothic vibe of the Hookman version. Mikami, the father of the series who rallied against the extreme alterations made in what would become Devil May Cry, still felt the need to shake up and modernise the series in 4. Since the release of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, there had been not 1, not 2, but 9 spin-off releases, most of which replicated the survival horror, zombie-killing, fixed camera action of the original. On a side note, the 2002 remake of the first Resident Evil game is outstanding. For those who haven't played it, I highly recommend picking it up on Xbox or PlayStation Store or wherever you can, as it is in my opinion one of the best horror games ever made and makes the original game feel borderline unplayable by comparison. So although many of his team lamented some of the proposed changes, Mikami, along with the game's producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi, felt that the series needed to be invigorated. And if that meant toning down the horror and changing the very way the game is played, then so be it. It's hard to imagine that either man knew just how impactful these changes would be on the gaming landscape as a whole. And so it was. On January 11th, 2005, Resident Evil 4 was released on the Nintendo GameCube, initially as an exclusive before being ported over to other consoles. Fans that had seen the series morph through various different iterations over the preceding 4 years and were eager to get their hands on the final version. It starts out inconspicuously enough, with a short intro video providing a quick synopsis of the story from the previous games up until that point. It also sets up the story around which much of the game is anchored. The US President's daughter, Ashley Graham, has been kidnapped by a cult named Los Illuminados and is being held somewhere in rural Spain. Leon S. Kennedy, rookie cop from Resident Evil 2, who somehow got fast-tracked to the position of high-ranking government agent, has been given the task of finding and rescuing Ashley. Alone. By himself. Well, aside from 2 laid-back Spanish cops who die within the first 2 minutes. It's hokey. I mean really hokey. And truthfully, the story doesn't really get any better from here. Look, I'm a sucker for a good story in a video game, so this should have been off-putting from the start. But, as I and others would soon discover, the subpar plot and the importance it carries on the experience as a whole would be relegated as of little to no importance within the first 15 minutes. You stop at a house in the middle of nowhere and ask your police companions to pull over so you can go in and investigate. Upon entering, you see a man standing in front of a fireplace. You pull out a picture of Ashley Graham and ask him if he's seen her. The man is a moody bastard, however, and spews something aggressively at you in Spanish, so you decide to cut your losses and leave him be. Only he has other plans, pulling out an axe and lunging at you violently. In self-defense, Leon pulls out his gun and trails it on the target. It's here that you get your first look at the new enemy. He's not a zombie or a ghost. However, one look into his red eyes indicates that while he is human, there's something inhuman about him. As he lunges at you, you see that his movements are unpredictable and erratic, as he moves his head out of the way of your pistol's laser sight. The music that plays in the background too, accompanying this scene, is wonderfully composed, a swell of bells and percussion that is genuinely unsettling and ramps up the tension significantly. He still has his faculties about him, and this makes him an unsettling adversary in a way. Still, you drop him with a few bullets, before windows in the house start to break, and more of these subhuman humans come barreling through the door. Frantically searching for ammunition and a way out, Leon finally dispatches of the remaining enemies. Leaving the house, he looks down at a riverbed below the bridge he just crossed and sees the flaming wreckage of the car he and his compadres used to get here. You realise now that you were on your own. Even still, there is a moment of calm as the cutscene ends and the music stops, and it's clear that the threat is no longer there. Logic dictates that this served as the opening level of the game, an initiation into the world of Resident Evil 4. However, this is merely a precursor, a warning shot of what is to come. After a call to your radio support Hannigan, Leon has no choice but to press forward. It's here that you get the first proper feel for your new environment. Below a cement grey sky, you walk through a desolate woodland populated by crows and scattered bear traps. For a moment there is no music, with the only sound you can hear being the caw of crows and Leon's footsteps thudding dully as you move. The familiar swell does reoccur sporadically though, when you encounter the odd villager, but you can now kill these stragglers with relative confidence. After walking for a period of time, Leon finally reaches the village path. Peering through his binoculars, he sees one of his cop buddies literally burning at a stake, while the people go about their daily lives doing farming chores like it's business as usual. From here you can go in guns blazing or try to sneak around them. Either way, conflict is inevitable, and it's here that things get interesting. Upon firing the first shot, Leon will be confronted by a horde of enemies, a literal village full in fact, and that now familiar musical swell will start. Armed with only a pistol, now you start to feel thoroughly overwhelmed and outgunned as angry village residents begin throwing knives and lurching forward at you with pitchforks. Survive to kill enough enemies and a cutscene will be triggered, which sees Leon enter a house and barricade the front door with a bookcase. There is a moment of respite as Leon gathers himself before the sound of glass shattering upstairs occurs. They're coming through the windows. Shit, I didn't even know they could come through the window. The house is full of windows. There are no more bookcases. Then all of a sudden you hear it. The universally familiar whirring sound that can only mean one thing. Leon looks out the window to confirm his biggest fear. A large man with a burlap sack over his head is charging towards the house, wielding a chainsaw with murderous intentions. A panic sets over the player as he ransacks the house for ammo. Making your way upstairs, you mercifully find a shotgun and some grenades. Meanwhile, the villagers are climbing through the upstairs windows via ladders and rooftops. You obliterate a row of them with the shotgun, knocking back those behind them. The upgrade in firepower gives you a renewed sense of confidence. However, the others have broken through the front door, and the sound of spinning death blades are coming barreling up the stairs. You aim your shotgun right at Leatherface's head, pulling the trigger, expecting an explosion of matter. However, it only staggers him for a moment. You then realise that he is not like the others, and will require a barrage of shotgun shells to be put down, if he can be put down at all. The preceding moments are somewhat of a blurry free-for-all, and will completely depend on how the player reacts to the given situation. You may take to the rooftops, picking off enemies one by one until they swarm you, causing you to jump to the ground below. You may take them on a Benny Hill style foot chase, stopping to blast hordes of enemies with your shotgun between sprints in the opposite direction while frantically reloading your weapons and using first aid sprays. You may seek refuge in a bell tower, headshotting enemies as they follow you up the ladder, at least until Leatherface makes his way up. You may freeze in front of Leatherface altogether, and watch as he lobs your head clean off in a moment of frankly horrendous violence, forcing you to start it all over again. One thing is for sure, that chainsaw keeps revving and those enemies keep charging. This goes on for what feels like forever until a bell sounds. The villagers suddenly drop their weapons, look towards the village church. One of them mutters something about Lord Sadler as they all stagger in a placid fashion towards the village's front door, walking inside and locking it behind them. Leon, confused, looks around, quipping, "Where's everybody going, bingo?" as the words Resident Evil appear on the screen. Did you ever have one of those moments in life when somebody gave you a piece of advice that you didn't want to take? Fuck you, you're wrong, I'm right, let's do it my way. Hell, it worked before. Why wouldn't it work now? But for whatever reason, you end up taking it. And within 5 minutes of taking it, you instantly realise that you made the right decision. In a moment of perfect hindsight, you see both paths you could have taken, thank the Lord you took the one you did, and actually feel a little embarrassed that you fought so hard against the path you eventually walked. Well, that's how I imagine the dissenting voices in Capcom, and the fans wary of the game's new direction, felt seconds after completing Resident Evil 4's psychotic interactive opening monologue. I don't want to spend too much time in this video comparing Resident Evil 4 to others in the series, or talk about how much of a radical departure it was from the traditional Resident Evil formula, because this game deserves more respect than that. However, it's worth looking at this scene in the context of when it was released. The biggest worry people had was that deviating too far from the survival horror roots of the original PlayStation games would ruin the series. That an increased focus on action would destroy the tension and atmosphere, the very foundation the games were built upon, and the very essence of the series. However, that village sequence from Resident Evil 4 is not just arguably the best moment in the entire series, it is inarguably one of the most tense. Not in a zombie rising from the ground to eat your brains kind of way, but in a more realistic, this lunatic with a chainsaw has me cornered kind of way. The beauty of this moment is that it kind of encapsulates everything great about Resident Evil 4 mechanically. The switch to the behind the shoulder camera was a touch of genius. Not only did it make the game feel more modern on the new, more modern hardware, but it just makes the game feel so damn playable. Firing a gun from this vantage point puts you right in the heart of the action. Moreover, it just gave you a new sense of freedom that was unimaginable in a Resident Evil game up until that point. And with enemies attacking you from all angles, your limited periphery ratcheted up the sense of urgency and fear tenfold, as you didn't always know whether or not an enemy was behind you, or how many were around you. Its third-person shooter camera wasn't just a dramatic improvement for the series, it had a direct influence on how future third-person games would, and continue to be made. Examples include the Gears of War franchise, the Uncharted and Last of Us games, and the Dead Space and Arkham series, among countless others which utilised Resident Evil 4's offset third-person perspective and shooting mechanic. In short, the changes were made to Resident Evil 4 were not only great for the series, but they had a huge impact on the entire industry. And while later Resident Evil games would bring these worries to fruition, leaning too heavily on action, watering down the formula to where it wasn't even a Resident Evil game anymore, and almost tarnishing the series beyond repair, on Resident Evil 4, Capcom created a perfect balance between white-knuckle action and terror. In other words, they struck gold. Carefully crafted gold. As good as the opening section is, and as much as it encapsulates the very best of the game, there is still a lot of game left to play. And I mean a lot. Resident Evil 4 is a long game, especially for an action horror title. First time you play through it, you're looking at about 20 hours until you reach the final credits. The game is split up into 5 chapters, with each chapter divided into sub-chapters. But really the easiest way to break the game down is by area or location, of which there are 3. The lion's share of the game takes place across the first 2 areas, the first of which is the village. After surviving the aforementioned chainsaw mob onslaught, and by extension completing Chapter 1's first sub-chapter, the player gets the opportunity to gather their bearings and really take a look around. And I must say, Resident Evil 4 looks really great for a 16-year-old game. Even when it was released back in 2005, I remember it being one of the better looking games on the market. Now, some of the hallmarks of the 6th generation's limitations are there. The jagged edges, muddy textures, and stiff body movements. But overall, the game still looks good visually. The facial animations are surprisingly decent, while the game's architecture, churches, castles, houses, all hold up. While you certainly wouldn't mistake it for a modern game, it doesn't fall into the category of so ugly it's difficult to enjoy it, that many other games unfortunately do. As you progress through the game, more of the story's details come to life. In a nutshell, and without spoiling too much, the residents of the village that attack Leon are under the control of Las Plagas, a parasite that infects the mind and the body of the host and makes them susceptible to the bidding of Los Illuminados and its cult leader, Lord Sadler. His plan is to infect the president's daughter with the parasite so that she could in turn infect her father, the president, with the parasite, so that Sadler can control him and, presumably take over the world. Again, as I said before, this is not top quality storytelling we're talking about here. This is low-level dystopian writing at its worst. Normally for me, if a game hinges in any significant way in its story, and I can't buy into it, it pretty much taints the whole experience for me. But in Resident Evil 4, this doesn't bother me as much. In fact, it barely bothers me at all. Almost as if Resident Evil 4 is the exception to the rule. I think the reason for this is because Resident Evil 4 plays to its strengths so damn well. The game's main strengths are threefold: its atmosphere, its combat, and its pacing. I've already gone over atmosphere a little bit, so I'll come back to it in a moment. So let's take a look at the combat first. Combat here is, like most games, relatively straightforward when broken down mechanically. Resident Evil 4 is a game where you shoot things until they die. It's what you kill them with, and how it feels to kill them that makes all the shooting and killing so awesome. During the game's early stages, you have 4 main weapons: a pistol, a knife, a shotgun, and 3 types of grenades. Your pistol will be your bread and butter initially. It holds the most bullets, fires the quickest, and has the biggest supply of accessible ammunition scattered around the map for you to pick up and use. When you start to encounter smaller groups of enemies, like say a few stable hands at a farmhouse, you'll naturally begin to experiment more with these weapons, and see the different kinds of damage each one can dole out. If you take your pistol and shoot a man in the stomach, he'll lurch forward. Shoot him in the shoulder, and the impact will fling his arm behind his body. Shoot him in the leg, and he'll collapse to the ground, unable to walk on it momentarily. This is where your knife comes in handy, and soon you'll be slashing at incapacitated opponents to save precious ammunition. The shotgun is obviously best used in close quarters situations. If you find yourself surrounded by a horde of infected, a shotgun blast will stagger most, if not all, of the horde backwards, giving you just a few seconds to escape and take a better vantage point. And a shotgun slug to the head, well, let's just say it'll make quick work of whoever is in front of you. The grenades, which come in the form of stun, incendiary and explosive, are effective at incapacitating or taking out multiple enemies also, but obviously should be lobbed from a safe distance. Soon enough, however, you'll outgrow the pistol and shotgun, and will be in need of some more powerful or effective firepower. And with very few weapons just laying around waiting for you to steal them, there is only one place for Leon to get them. The merchant plays a pivotal role in Resident Evil 4. Appearing in different places throughout the game, he provides Leon with weaponry, and has an arsenal which expands as you advance through the story. Leon can pay for these guns using pesetas found in barrels and boxes or dropped by enemies. It should be noted that the currency of Spain had been euro for 3 years by the time Resident Evil 4 came out. Maybe euro just didn't seem as creepy, I don't know. He also sells treasures that he finds for money, which can then be used to buy guns. You can also sell your weapons, typically when you want to buy a more advanced version of the current one that you're selling, like trading in your conventional shotgun for a semi-automatic striker shotgun. As I said, over time the merchant provides you with a variety of pistols and shotgun variants, but on top of that he also sells automatic SMGs and rifles and some more advanced weapons like mine launchers and RPGs. Most of these weapons can be upgraded, making them more powerful for Leon to use and more valuable if you choose to sell them. While it's true that there are more weapons now than ever, it never feels like a full-on action game. Weapons and their upgrades are expensive, so you really have to think carefully about every purchase, meaning you never feel like you're completely overmatching your enemies. You'll also need to buy a bigger weapons case as you progress through the game to hold all these weapons. They're very expensive too, and are just small enough to make you think twice about what to stock and how to stock them, while just big enough to allow you to carry what you need, staying at least somewhat true to the ammo rationing survival horror mechanic established in the first game. This is where the third of the 3 key elements of Resident Evil 4 intersects with the combat, and that's the game's pacing. I've spoken about pacing at length in all 3 of these retrospectives, so much so that for my next classic video game review, I'm going to try to pick a game that doesn't rely so much on pacing, like a first-person shooter or a platformer. I mention it so frequently though, because I feel like pacing is simultaneously one of the most overlooked and important aspects of games in general. And I'm going to make a bold statement here and say that Resident Evil 4 has the best pacing out of any game I've ever played. Ever. And without an interesting story to push it forward, Resident Evil 4 has to rely on 2 other elements to keep things interesting, and those are its environment and its enemies. Resident Evil 4, for the vast majority of its playthrough, never gets old or stagnant because it constantly changes up its environments and or the combat challenges it puts in front of you. This could be something subtle like introducing a new level design, or something big like throwing a major boss fight at you. The game also has this amazing ability to make relatively arbitrary tasks feel like significant accomplishments. I believe Resident Evil 4 does this by combining these combat challenges with the game's atmosphere, tension, and the changes in environment. Take this section near the start of the game. All you have to do is make your way through this hilly landscape of crisscrossing bridges, find 2 pieces of a stone hexagon so you can put it in a door, open said door, and simply move on to the next part of the map. The enemies you come across are the same as the ones you've dealt with thus far, but the foreign level design, which is the most linear and claustrophobic up until this point, adds an unfamiliar dynamic which immediately takes the player out of their comfort zone. It's an incredible thing to say, but simply waiting or shooting your way through these enemies and making your way through the door at the end of the level gives you a sense of accomplishment as a gamer, much more than it should. And maybe accomplishment is the wrong word. Maybe relief is more appropriate. That feeling of vulnerability, surviving an encounter rather than confidently smashing through it. Combine this feeling with progressively challenging enemy AI and the pure playability of the game, and it's just a perfect storm of exceptional gameplay. The first major boss you come across, and this is a minor spoiler, is Del Lago, an amphibious monster Leon encounters while on a boat on the village lake. While the common enemies in the game seem relatively surmountable, particularly after multiple encounters, the bosses in Resident Evil 4, especially in the village section, confront Leon with completely unique environments and challenges. While attempting to cross the lake, the monster attacks you, and Leon must defeat this creature armed with only a spear, chucking it at the creature every chance he gets. However, the anchor of the boat is stuck in the beast's flesh, and it drags you around the lake at high speeds. This ramps up the chaos of the situation, as Leon must steer the boat between attacks in order to avoid hitting the objects scattered around the lake. Should Leon hit an object, or allow this giant fish to hit the boat, he will be flung from it, initiating a Quicktime event where Leon must frantically mash a button to swim back to his vessel and to safety. The lower Leon's health, the slower he swims, adding yet another dynamic to the fight. Upon completing the boss, a cutscene will be triggered, where Leon suddenly notices that the anchor's rope is wrapped around his leg. Another Quicktime event will pop up to get Leon to cut the rope free. Failing to do so will result in death. This encounter is different from anything else you'll do on the most fundamentally mechanical levels, and the other two bosses in the village subvert the gameplay in similar ways, be it mechanically, environmentally, or a combination of the two. I'm not going to get into details of these encounters here, as I don't want to spoil any more than I have to, but know that they are just as thrilling as Del Lago, especially a certain encounter in a fiery barn. And thrilling really is an appropriate word. Most games try to give the impression that their boss encounters are truly formidable. But if we're being honest with ourselves as players, very few games actually manage to convey that feeling successfully. The genius of Resident Evil 4 is that the game doesn't just do this by making them harder to kill. I mean, any game can ramp up the difficulty for certain enemies. The bosses feel more intimidating, more frightening, through a combination of their character design, their abilities and attacks, and the strange new environments where they confront you in conjunction with the heightened difficulty. When you dispose of Del Lago, a somewhat substantial portion of this section will be devoted to backtracking through the village. Backtracking is a common occurrence in linear action-adventure games, oftentimes at a detriment to the experience. Going back to areas of a game you've already completed can be monotonous, and can often be down to unimaginative or downright lazy game design. Resident Evil 4 navigates this cleverly, however, due to its masterful pacing and progression. By the time you started treading on old ground, the grey evening sky will have shifted to the rain-soaked darkness of night. There is a subtle change in the music also, with a bizarre mixture of atonal horns and furious vibrations now providing the soundtrack to the horror. Whereas up until now, you were conditioned to fight when you heard the music, as it only occurred when an enemy spotted you. This music plays constantly, meaning you have to rely on your own sight or on audio cues from the Ganados or the sound of flying stabby projectiles. The only time the music stops is when you're indoors in places like save rooms, where the safe music, Serenity, echoes in the background, letting you know that you're safe. Speaking of which, I don't know when we're going to talk about this again, so I'm just going to say it here. The music in Resident Evil 4 is awesome. The vast majority of it is difficult to appreciate compositionally, just because it's typically an atonal mess. Even though it's an atonal mess that fits the tone of the game perfectly and increases the tension tenfold. The save room theme and the typewriter themes, though, are really wonderful. Resident Evil games are known for their save music, and these are among the best in the series. So while the voice acting and sound effects are oftentimes rudimentary more than they are outstanding, the music is consistently excellent. Aside from the tonal shifts in music and weather, we see an evolution in some of the Ganados also. Now when you headshot some of them, instead of their heads exploding and then, them dying, A mutated version of the Plagas virus will spurt from their neck, simultaneously keeping them alive and giving Leon a new enemy type to deal with. Whereas normal Ganados will grab Leon and attempt to strangle, cut, or burn him, attacks which, assuming your health isn't near zero, can easily be shaken off and countered with a roundhouse kick or suplex. These parasitic Ganados are lethal and can take you out with one strike, so you need to keep your distance and land headshots until it is subdued. All this backtracking will eventually lead you back to the village area you encountered at the start of the game. Here will be a good time to focus on two of the more contentious gameplay elements in Resident Evil 4. In order to go through a giant door which leads you into the second portion of the village section, you need the assistance of a partner. That partner is Ashley Graham, who, minor spoiler alert, you recovered moments earlier at a church by the village graveyard. The Ashley sections of the game play like your typical escort mission. Buttons are allocated to specific commands, mainly wait there, follow me, and hide. Ashley is a civilian with no combat experience, so your only goal is to keep her alive. This works out for the best as it puts more of the onus on the player. If you see a gang of bloodthirsty Ganados are on the horizon, and you fail to tell Ashley to hide, and she then subsequently gets recaptured or killed, you'll blame yourself before you'll blame the game, which is always better. The escorting moments add a certain amount of variety to the game. However, they are somewhat uninspired and don't particularly add much to the experience otherwise. It's one of those things where if you absolutely hate escort missions, you're going to hate these sections regardless. I will say, however, that I'm glad that these missions don't occur more than they do. Otherwise, they would have run the risk of totally outstaying their welcome and would have become tedious or annoying. I will say this. There is a part of the game later on where you play just as Ashley, and it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, having to bypass the game's enemies with no weapons and practically no form of attack adds a different element of fear to the game. However, it also shoehorns in some new Ashley-specific gameplay features which just aren't that interesting, making it somewhat underwhelming mechanically when compared to the rest of the game. Aside from that, all she can really do is help you access certain areas and solve certain puzzles. Speaking of which, let's talk briefly about the puzzles. And I will say briefly because, well, there aren't that many, and those that there are, the very few of them, for the most part, are really easy to solve. This was a blow for series veterans, as aside from the zombie slaying gameplay and ammo management, puzzles were probably the next big thing that the series was most known for. The increased weight the game puts on straight up action makes this less of an issue than in other games, where sections of isolation were more prominent. That being said, I think a lot of people, myself included, wouldn't have complained had more puzzles and more difficult ones at that been included in Resident Evil 4. The last gameplay elements I'm going to look at here before we move on are the Quicktime Events. I've briefly mentioned them twice so far, but haven't really focused on them. The QTEs are easily the most contentious aspect of the game. For me, context is critical here. The first time you're presented with one of these prompts, like the aforementioned boat QTE, it catches you off guard and really drives home that sense of needing to be on your toes at all times. The problem, however, is when they become too frequent. The first time a group of villagers drops a giant boulder on you from a cliff, the accompanying QTE will likely result in you frantically pressing the buttons on your controller, followed very likely by Leon getting crushed in brutal fashion. However, the second time this happens, you know exactly how to deal with it, and thus it doesn't elicit the panic it was designed to induce. They also appear in certain combat situations, hence the aforementioned suplexes and martial arts kicks. All in all, the QTEs are occasionally experience enhancing, are often tolerable and, when overutilized or used inappropriately, boring and predictable. While nothing in the game will be as iconic as the opening half of the village sequence, the majority of what is left in the game is just as entertaining, gripping, and addictive to play through. This again comes down to the game's perfect pacing. A shootout in a house that occurs at the very beginning of the second half of the village section again reaffirms the game's ability to make old mechanics feel fresh by changing the level design. Trapped inside with Louise, a friend you make at the beginning of the game who helps Leon out of a jam or two, but whom our protagonist doesn't fully trust, the Ganados attack from all sides, breaking through windows and doors on boat floors while you're trapped inside. It's a tense and tough encounter, is the first time Leon is fighting alongside a combat-savvy NPC, and is a set piece, much like the Del Lago boss, that is unlike anything else in the game. Needless to say, as you move on from here, the quality doesn't dip one iota as you make your way through the rest of the village. The second section of the game takes place in an old medieval castle. I'm going to have to be very careful here not to spoil more than I have to. However, the sudden shift from the rural woods, lakes and mountains to the regal interiors of this sprawling building is, in a way, almost a spoiler in itself, as it is such a drastic tonal shift. The atmosphere and gameplay mechanics remain consistent with the village sections even here, but the castle just has its own unique vibe and flavour, and in that way gives itself a certain autonomy from the previous portion of the game. It's not really fair to say which one of these areas is better than the other. You may have a preference for one, which is fair enough. However, both levels share a lot of the same qualities while having their own unique strengths also. The first thing to note about the castle is obviously the environment. A visual holdover from the Devil May Cry demo, it contains wide open courtyards, a beautiful unspoiled hallway decorated with chandeliers, portraits and velvet carpets. The developers juxtapose these aesthetically pleasing surroundings with some of the creepiest areas in Resident Evil 4. And indeed, the castle's sewers and dungeons are home to some of the most intense moments in the whole game. Another thing that balances out your new, relatively pleasing environment are the new batch of creatures you have to face. I'm only going to detail the castle ganados, but let's just say that they are the least intimidating and easiest to dispose of out of all the monsters that lurk in the castle. They function almost identically to the village ganados, but are draped in a cultish garb and chant in repetitive monotone, giving them a creepier, almost vintage Resident Evil vibe than the more aggressive, lifelike villagers. The other enemies are more challenging and much scarier. They've also got abilities that others up until this point had not possessed. These range from severely heightened sense of hearing, to the ability to fly, to the ability to turn almost completely invisible. That being said, the first sign of a dip in quality in Resident Evil 4 rears its head during the game's remaining boss fights. One genuinely pant-wetting battle involving a sewer and a shit ton of nitrogen aside, almost all the bosses from this point onwards rely a little too much on either straight up action or pomp and circumstance. Don't get me wrong, the other bosses in the game are also action heavy, and usually end with a floor full of empty shell casings. However, not an ounce of atmosphere is sacrificed in the name of gunplay. The bosses in the second half of the game are equally as challenging. However, because they don't have the same aura of terror around them, it kinda strips away some of the game's mystique. Now, most of them are fundamentally fine, and some of them are pretty fun, but you'll find your attention being drawn to the mechanics of the encounter, the heightened difficulty, the weak points on an enemy, etc, etc. A trap the previous encounters avoided by immersing the player in the fear and panic of the situation, making that the primary focus. However, these encounters are few and far between, and the rest of the castle section otherwise maintains the atmosphere and flawless pacing of the game, and in no small part due to the other enemies and animals that are trying to destroy you. Another thing that maintains this pace that I've been going on and on about is just the castle itself. It is an absolutely massive playground, with a huge main area, a full network of sewers and dungeons, and a litany of subsections and separate buildings. One of this section's biggest and most unique strengths is just how much fun it is to explore. The village area is a blast to negotiate, but it's very linear. Most of the time it's easy to navigate through because oftentimes there's only one way to go. And in parts where you have a choice on which path to take, you literally have to pick one over the other, with both of them leading to the same destination regardless. Resident Evil 4 is a linear game by nature, and no matter how you choose to navigate the castle, the outcome from a storyline perspective will be the exact same either way. However, there are more rooms and places in this area that don't have any bearing on the main game, but which you can explore if you so wish, even though the game really has no impetus to send you there. But aside from this, I think the castle is just really enjoyable to make your way through, even if you do it in a purely linear fashion. And what I said about Resident Evil 4 making relatively benign tasks seem like big accomplishments reigns just as true here. Things like going through a small grassy maze, or getting from one end of a sewer line to the other, feel like significant achievements due again to the formidable nature of the game's enemies and its atmosphere. The first time you finish the game's castle section and find yourself moving on to its final act, you will probably be thinking to yourself, God, it simply can't get any better than this. And you will be right. Unfortunately, the game's third act, the island section, cannot hold up compared to the rest of the game. Actually, to be completely honest, it's pretty underwhelming and borders on damn right disappointing. There are only two good things about this section. The first is that it's mercifully brief, and the second is the introduction of the game's most terrifying creation. Obviously by now, you know I'm not going to say what it is, but let's just say that anyone who's ever heard this in the game will know exactly what I'm talking about. The reason that the island section doesn't hold up as well as the rest of the game is for the same reason that many of the castle boss battles aren't as good as the village boss battles, and that is the reliance on action over tension. They also rely heavily on a cover mechanic in this section, which was utilised very briefly in other parts of the game. It served its purpose there by switching up the gameplay momentarily and keeping things fresh. However, in this portion of the game, it almost switches the genre from third-person survival horror to third-person duck and fire arcade shooter. More Resident Evil Dead Aim than Resident Evil 4. When I look at this section, it almost feels to me like Mikami and his team felt like the only way to continue challenging the player and keep things interesting was by utilising these mechanics and throwing an inordinate amount of firepower at the player. Does it make it more challenging? I mean, maybe. The problem is that it doesn't matter. Remember earlier when I spoke briefly about the merchant that sells you weapons? Well, by this point you've most likely assembled an arsenal of highly powered, upgraded weapons, so you're more than equipped to deal with this problem. The other issue is that, in the context of a video game, being shot at just isn't that scary. Otherwise, Call of Duty would be borderline unplayable. Remember we looked at how small, incremental changes in enemy AI and environment can make a huge difference to the experience? One of the reasons why I analysed the opening village chase and the nighttime village house showdown is that, aside from not wanting to spoil the rest of the game through deep analysis, I wanted to show this theory of incremental change in practice. At that point in the game, had the team put Leon in another similar showdown with the villagers in an open area, it may have been fun, but its impact would have been greatly diminished. Simply confining the player to a house literally made all the difference. The only discernible change, aside from the level design, is that some of the Ganados have that mutated Plagas virus. But even with that said, Leatherface doesn't appear once in this section, so that kind of makes even that point redundant in a way. The fact of the matter is that your appetite for scares, exploration, and the general resi vibe will not have diminished by this point in the game, evidenced by how fondly people remember the new monster that appears in this section. I feel like if they had kept the creep factor up and made very subtle changes to the gameplay, they could have maintained the atmosphere and immersion up through its final chapters. But alas, when they throw a burly, human-looking Ganado with a minigun and a bullet belt at you, you know instinctively from playing straight-up shooter games that all you have to do is fill this bastard full of lead until he drops, which takes away from that Resident Evil mystique completely. The final boss also sucks too. I mean, there's just no way around it. You know by now I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's not scary, or tense, or even very fun. It's basically just the game throwing a lot of crap at you, trying to impress you. But Resident Evil 4 for the majority of its playthrough isn't that kind of game. In Resident Evil 4, the challenge and the fun comes in overcoming the terror of the unknown, not a piece of advanced weaponry. Some have argued that Resident Evil 4 marked the beginning of the end for the series, at least until the release of Resident Evil 7 in 2017, which single-handedly rejuvenated the series and brought respect back to the Resident Evil name. However, I think this is just cynical hindsight. The way I see it, Resident Evil 5 was the game where the scales tilted more in favour of action over horror, while the woeful Resident Evil 6 was the game where the series jumped the shark entirely, subjecting fans to a weak, Hollywood-inspired shoot-'em-up, which was Resident Evil in name only. With all that being said, I think the final act of Resident Evil 4 is where the seeds of what would become the series were unfortunately planted. So even though there are still some scares and great moments left in the old girl by this stage, a good chunk of the island section feels almost like a spiritual prologue to Resident Evil 5. And this is why it doesn't really fit with the rest of the game, atmospherically, mechanically, and just in terms of pure quality. So even though Resident Evil 4 suffers from what my first classic game Bioshock suffers from, which I will call Final Act Syndrome, this should not deter you from playing it if you haven't. Resident Evil 4 is one of the best games I've ever played, and it holds a very special place in my memory. Its pacing is simply unparalleled, and its atmosphere and vibe is wonderfully tense. The gameplay holds up wonderfully even in 2021. Forget how influential its over-the-shoulder perspective was on the industry. Taken on its own merits, it's still simply a blast to run and shoot and explore in this game. Resident Evil 4 is more than a game. It's truly an amazing experience. The story is hokey for sure, but I can think of no other game that makes simply going from point A to point B so satisfying and rewarding. In short, if you haven't played this game, you're doing yourself a disservice, as it is one of the finest games ever created.